Let's turn now to a discussion of wage rates under differing market structures in both the labor and product markets. And let's start with imperfect competition in the product market. What do you think will be the big difference here? In an imperfectly competitive market, the monopolist, the oligopolist, or the monopolistic competitor will face a demand curve for its product that is downward sloping. That, in turn, means that the firm must accept a lower price to increase its sales. The important point here is that the lower price that accompanies every increase in output applies in each case not only to the marginal product of each successive worker, but also to all prior units which otherwise would be sold at a higher price. We can illustrate what happens in this situation by slightly altering our previous table. Let's start with column 4. Here we assume that product price must be lower to sell the marginal product of each successive worker. For example, if the product price is $2.40, the firm will sell 13 units. However, in order to sell 27 units, it must lower its price to $1.75. For this declining price schedule, take a minute to recalculate the total revenue by filling in column 5. Here's what your table should look like. Did you get it right? Now let's try something more difficult. Let's recalculate the marginal revenue product in column 6. What would the MRP be for 2 units of labor? The answer is $13. Here's how we calculate that. The second worker's marginal product is 6 units. These 6 units can be sold for $2.40 each, or as a group for $14.40. But this is not the MRP of the second worker. To sell these 6 units, the firm must take a 20-cent price cut on the 7 units produced by the first worker, units which could have been sold for $2.60 each. Thus, the MRP of the second worker is calculated by first multiplying the total number of units sold, 7, times the price drop of 20 cents. This equals $1.40, which is then subtracted from $14.40, yielding $13. Here's what the rest of column 6 looks like. Given these results, here's a tough question. Will the MRP curve be more or less elastic for the imperfectly competitive producer relative to the purely competitive producer? The MRP curve for the imperfectly competitive producer will be less elastic than that of a purely competitive producer. At a wage rate of $11.95, and therefore an MRC of $11.95, both the purely competitive and the imperfectly competitive seller will hire 2 workers. However, at a wage rate of $9.95, the competitive firm will hire 3 workers, while the imperfectly competitive firm will hire only 2 workers. This observation has an important implication. Other things equal, the imperfectly competitive producer will produce less of the product than the perfect competitor. In doing so, the imperfectly competitive producer will also employ fewer workers and, more broadly, fewer factors of production. Okay, let's go back to assuming perfect competition in the product market. But now, let's ask ourselves the question, what happens if there is imperfect competition in the labor market itself? In this case, there are 2 polar possibilities, monopsony and monopoly. The typical example of monopsony is the so-called company town. And monopsony has the following characteristics. First, the firm's employment is a large portion of the total employment of a particular kind of labor, such as coal mining or food processing. Second, the workers are relatively immobile, meaning that workers don't or can't move easily from the area. This might happen if they have strong family ties to an area, It may also happen in the sense that if workers sought alternative employment, they would have to acquire new skills. In fact, monopsony-type situations are not uncommon in the United States. From New England textile mill and Colorado silver mining towns to Farm Belt food processing communities and remote Montana mining areas, the economies of many towns and cities in America depend almost entirely on one major firm. In the monopsony case, the firm is a wage maker, meaning that the wage rate it pays varies directly with the number of workers it employs. And unlike a firm hiring workers in a perfectly competitive market, the monopsonist does not simply hire all the labor it wants at the equilibrium market wage. Instead, the monopsonist faces an upward sloping market supply curve, such as is depicted in this figure. In this situation, if the monopsonist wants to increase the number of workers that it hires, it must increase the wage that it pays to all workers, including those currently on its payroll. Thus, and here's the punchline, the monopsonist's MRC is not equal to the wage paid to the additional worker, as in perfect competition, but rather is equal to a higher amount. This table illustrates why the MRC is greater than the wage rate. See if you can fill in several of the blanks in column 4. The math is very similar to our earlier example of calculating the MRP under imperfect competition. Did you get it right? You can see that one worker can be hired at $6, but hiring a second worker forces the firm to pay a higher wage of $7. That means the MRC is $8, the $7 paid to the second worker, plus the $1 raise for the first worker. Thus, the total labor cost is $14. The point is that the monopsonist's MRC exceeds the wage rate. Graphically, this means the MRC curve lies above the supply curve of labor, as shown in our figure. Where do you think equilibrium will be in this market, and why? Applying our MRP equals MRC profit maximizing rule, we find that equilibrium occurs at a wage of W sub M and a quantity of Q sub M. More importantly, we find that both wages and the level of employment are less under monopsony than in a perfectly competitive labor market. From this result, you can perhaps see why so-called company towns have been accused of exploiting their workforce. Let's turn now to the other side of the labor market coin, the case of monopoly. Monopoly in the labor market occurs when workers are able to act collectively as a single bargaining unit. The most obvious way this might happen is through the vehicle of a labor union. Using their monopoly power, unions can compel firms to provide wages, benefits, and working conditions that are above the competitive outcome. For example, if a non-union plumber earns $15 per hour in Alabama, a union might bargain with a large construction firm to set the wage at $25 per hour for that firm's plumbers. But such an agreement will only be valuable if the union can restrict the firm's access to alternative labor supplies. Hence, under a typical collective bargaining agreement, firms agree not to hire non-union plumbers, not to contract out plumbing services, and not to subcontract work to non-union firms. Each of these provisions help prevent erosion of the union's monopoly lock on the supply of plumbers to the firm. This figure shows a typical equilibrium in a unionized labor market. Note that in this case, the wage rate, W sub U, is above the wage rate, W sub C, under perfect competition. And that is better, at least for workers, than the monopsony outcome. However, as with monopsony, employment is less than under perfect competition. In this case, the union workers with jobs are unquestionably better off, but those workers who are unemployed as a result of the union clearly are not. Well, that's the theory of union bargaining. But do unions really raise wages in practice? According to a number of studies, the answer is yes. On the basis of these analyses, economists have concluded that union workers receive, on average, wages that are 10 to 15% higher than those of non-union workers. This difference ranges from a negligible amount for hotel workers and barbers to 25 to 30% higher earnings for skilled construction workers or coal miners. Perhaps needless to say, the subject of unionism is controversial, and it is the focus of much debate among both economists and politicians. Indeed, the study of unions is an important part of understanding the dynamics of the U.S. labor market. About 1/7 of the workforce still belongs to a union. Furthermore, in negotiating collective bargaining contracts, unions raise issues that are important to all workers, issues ranging from pensions, health care benefits, and working hours.